They mocked his silence, finding amusement in the nervous stable boy who couldn't hear their taunts. Little did they know he was a predator in prey's clothing, a marshal whose badge lay hidden beneath 3 years of patient deception. When their laughter finally died that day, they learned too late that silence doesn't mean weakness. It means you never hear death coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust-covered town of Rattlesnake Junction sweltered under the merciless Arizona sun, its wooden buildings creaking in protest against the scorching heat. The year was 1875, and like most frontier settlements, it had its share of secrets buried beneath the parched earth, but none quite as deep as the ones about to surface. Thomas Quiet Tom Matthews had worked in Hendricks Stable for 3 years, his quick hands and attentive nature making him the finest stable hand in the territory, despite, or perhaps because of, his inability to hear. His world was one of vibrations and shadows, of reading intentions in the subtle shifts of bodies and the darkness that crossed men's faces. The horses loved him, responding to his gentle touch and calm demeanor with an almost supernatural understanding. Most folks in Rattlesnake Junction had grown accustomed to Tom's presence, treating him with a mix of pity and casual indifference. They'd wave when he crossed the street, motion exaggeratedly when they needed their horses tended to, and sometimes leave him extra coins out of misplaced sympathy. None of them knew that behind his seemingly simple smile lay a mind sharp as a razor and eyes that missed nothing. That scorching Tuesday afternoon, Tom felt the vibrations before he saw them. 3 heavily laden horses approaching from the east, their riders' spurs jangling against well-worn saddles. He was cleaning out the 3rd stall when their shadows darkened the stable entrance, bringing with them the acrid smell of gunpowder and trouble. The Blackwood gang had earned their reputation across 3 territories, leaving a trail of emptied bank vaults and grieving widows in their wake. Their leader, Marcus Blackwood, was a man whose smile never reached his eyes, and whose quick draw had sent 12 men to early graves. His companions, the Cruz brothers, Ricardo and Felipe, were equally notorious for their cruelty and precision with throwing knives. Tom kept his head down as they entered, his hands moving steadily through their familiar work, but his trained eyes caught every detail. The fresh blood on Marcus's boots, the way Ricardo favored his left arm, the fresh, wanted posters crumpled. In Felipe's saddlebag, 3 weeks of tracking of patient observation had led to this moment. "Hey, dummy!" Marcus's voice carried no sound to Tom's ears, but the cruel twist of his mouth told the story clearly enough. "I said, take care of these horses and be quick about it." He emphasized his words with exaggerated gestures and mocking faces, drawing snickers from the Cruz brothers. Tom nodded eagerly, his practiced mask of innocent servitude firmly in place. As he reached for the first horse's reins, Felipe deliberately scuffed his boots across the stable floor, kicking hay and dirt onto Tom's freshly cleaned boots. The brothers laughed, expecting the usual cowering response they got from most stable. Boys, but if they had been paying closer attention, they might have noticed how Tom's hands never trembled as they worked the leather straps. They might have seen how his eyes, while downcast, tracked every movement they made with military precision. They might have noticed the unusual calluses on his fingers, not just the rough patches of stable work, but the distinct patterns left by years of handling revolvers. What they certainly didn't notice was how, as Tom led their horses to their stalls, his fingers briefly traced the inside of each saddle, memorizing the hidden compartments where they'd stashed their latest stolen fortune. They didn't see him. Note the distinct limp in Ricardo's walk that spoke of a bullet wound poorly tended, or the way Felipe's gun belt had been hastily repaired, making his draw a fraction slower than it should be. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the stable doors as Tom worked, his movements efficient and purposeful. The Blackwood gang had chosen Rattlesnake Junction as their hideout, believing its remote location and fearful residents would provide perfect cover while they planned their next heist. They had no way of knowing they'd just handed their horses to the very man who'd been hunting them since they'd raided the cavalry payroll wagon 3 months ago, killing 6 soldiers in the process. As Tom finished stabling the last horse, his fingers brushed against the hidden pocket sewn into his vest, feeling the familiar shape of a U.S. Marshal's badge. 3 years of deep cover, playing the role of a deaf stable boy, were about to pay off. But timing was everything, and as he watched the Blackwood gang swagger toward the saloon, Tom allowed himself a small, grim smile. Sometimes the deadliest predator was the one you dismissed as harmless. The sun continued its relentless descent toward the horizon, painting Rattlesnake Junction in shades of blood red and deep purple. In the coming hours, the town would learn that silence could be more terrifying than any gunshot, and that true strength often came wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Inside the Rusty Spur saloon, the Blackwood gang made themselves comfortable. At their usual corner table, their mere presence causing other patrons to shift uneasily in their seats. The saloon's owner, Martha Hawkins, a sharp-witted widow who'd run the establishment since her husband's passing, watched them with carefully concealed disdain as she polished glasses behind the bar. Marcus Blackwood sprawled in his chair like a king on his throne, boots propped up on the worn wooden table as he surveyed his temporary domain. The Cruz brothers flanked him, their matching silver-handled knives glinting in the lamplight as they toyed with them absently. The message was clear. This was their territory now. "That simple stable boy," Marcus chuckled, taking a long draw from his whiskey. "Remind me of a puppy begging for scraps. Did you see how he jumped when Felipe kicked up that dirt?" Ricardo Cruz joined in the laughter, but his eyes kept darting to the saloon's entrance, a habit born from years of watching for lawmen and bounty hunters. What they didn't notice was how Martha's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the glass she was polishing. She'd known Thomas Matthews since he'd first arrived in Rattlesnake Junction, had watched him work tirelessly at the stable, and had seen something in his eyes that others missed. A patient, calculating intelligence that reminded her of a wolf, watching its prey. The saloon's deputy sheriff, young Billy Cooper, sat at the bar, deliberately keeping his back to the Blackwood gang. At 23, he was too green to challenge them, especially after what happened to Sheriff Jensen 2 weeks ago. The old sheriff had asked too many questions about their business and ended up with a broken jaw and 3 cracked ribs for his trouble. Now, he was recovering at his sister's place in Tucson, leaving Billy to maintain a delicate peace. The afternoon crowd thinned as regular patrons found reasons to finish their drinks and leave. Those who remained hugged the walls and spoke in whispers, their conversations a nervous undercurrent beneath the increasingly loud boasting of the Blackwood gang. Martha had seen this pattern before in other towns, how men like Marcus Blackwood would start small, testing boundaries before tightening their grip like a snake around its prey. "Hey, widow woman," Marcus called out, holding up his empty glass. "Another bottle, and make it the good stuff this time." He punctuated his demand by tossing a gold coin onto the floor rather than the bar, smirking as Martha was forced to walk over and bend down to retrieve it. As she straightened up, Martha caught a glimpse of movement through the window. Thomas was crossing the street, head down as usual, but his steps had a purpose that seemed different from his normal nervous energy. She'd always wondered about him, about the strange hours he kept, and the way he sometimes watched the comings and goings in town with an intensity that belied his simple facade. Felipe Cruz suddenly stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Think I'll go check on my horse," he announced. a predatory grin spreading across his face. "Make sure that dummy didn't mess anything up." Martha recognized the look. It was the same one he'd worn before starting the fight that had ended with Sheriff Jensen's beating. "Leave him be," Billy spoke up from his position at the bar, surprising even himself. "He's just a stable hand doing his job." His voice quavered slightly, but he forced himself to meet Marcus Blackwood's cold stare. Marcus rose slowly, his movement deliberate as a rattlesnake uncoiling. Well, looks like our young deputy's found his voice." He stepped closer to Billy, each boot fall echoing in the now silent saloon. "Tell me, boy, you willing to die over a deaf stable hand?" The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. Martha's hand moved beneath the bar where her shotgun waited, but she knew drawing it would only make things worse. The Cruz brothers watched the scene with amused anticipation, their fingers dancing along their knife handles. What none of them realized was that through the window, Thomas Matthews had observed the entire exchange. Though he couldn't hear the words, he read the scene like a book. The way Marcus positioned himself, the fear in Billy's posture, Martha's subtle reach for her hidden weapon. His careful planning had accounted for this moment, for how the Blackwood gang would inevitably reveal their true nature to the town. Outside, the sun continued its westward journey, and Thomas allowed himself a small nod. Soon, very soon, the careful groundwork he'd laid over 3 years would bear fruit. The Blackwood gang had chosen Rattlesnake Junction because they thought it weak, vulnerable. They were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous prey was the one that let you think you were the predator. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The confrontation began not with a bang, but with the soft crunch of boots on hay-strewn floorboards. Felipe Cruz entered the stable like a wolf into a henhouse, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the stable doors, creating bars of light and darkness that cut across his path. Thomas Matthews continued brushing down a chestnut mare, his back to the entrance. His trained senses felt the vibrations of Felipe's approach through the wooden floor, counted the steps, measured the pace. 3 years of playing the role of a deaf stable hand had taught him to read a man's intentions through the smallest changes in pressure beneath his feet. "Hey, dummy!" Felipe called out, knowing Thomas couldn't hear him, but enjoying the performance nonetheless. He reached out and knocked over a bucket of water, sending it clattering across the floor. The sudden movement spooked several horses, but notably not the ones belonging to the Blackwood gang. Thomas had already calmed them, earned their trust in the way only he could. Thomas turned, affecting the startled expression expected of him, but his eyes caught every detail. The way Felipe's right hand rested on his knife handle, the slight favoring of his left leg, the confident smirk of a man who thought he held all the cards. Behind that practiced mask of subservience, Thomas calculated angles, distances, potential weapons within reach. "Thought I'd make sure you didn't mess up our tack," Felipe drawled, making exaggerated gestures. He moved closer, deliberately invading Thomas's space. "Though I doubt you could understand proper horse care being simple and all." He reached out to shove Thomas's shoulder, a casual display of dominance he'd performed countless times before. What happened next would be talked about in Rattlesnake Junction for years to come. As Felipe's hand made contact, Thomas moved with the fluid grace of a lifetime's martial training. His left hand caught Felipe's wrist, turning the push into a pivot that sent the outlaw stumbling forward. Before Felipe could recover, Thomas had him pressed face first against the stable wall, arm twisted behind his back at an angle that promised agony with the slightest increase in pressure. Felipe's free hand scrabbled for his knife, but Thomas's boot came down on his wrist with precise force, enough to immobilize, not enough to break. Yet. The outlaw's mouth opened in a silent scream as Thomas increased the pressure on his twisted arm, just shy of dislocation. "I wouldn't," Thomas spoke, his voice clear and steady, lacking the awkward tones of someone who had never heard themselves speak. "3 broken fingers would make knife-throwing rather difficult, don't you think?" Felipe's eyes widened at the sound of that voice. Educated, confident, deadly. This was not the simpering stable boy who jumped at shadows. This was something else entirely. Thomas leaned closer, his lips near Felipe's ear. "Now, we're going to have a quiet conversation about the cavalry payroll your gang stole 3 months ago. And you're going to tell me everything, or we'll find out just how many bones I can break before your screams reach the saloon." Outside the stable, life in Rattlesnake Junction continued its normal rhythm. No one noticed the brief scuffle, and if they heard muffled sounds from the stable, well, that was just the simple stable hand going about his business. Inside, however, Felipe Cruz was learning that his gang had made a fatal error in judgment. 10 minutes later, Thomas released his hold, letting Felipe slump to the ground. The outlaw's face was ashen, his bravado replaced by genuine fear. He had just spent the longest minutes of his life discovering that the quiet stable boy was a trained killer who knew more about the Blackwood gang's operations than they did themselves. "Remember," Thomas said, straightening his vest with meticulous care, "if you warn your friends, if you try to run, if you so much as breathe a word of this conversation, I'll know. And next time, I won't be so gentle." He pulled Felipe up by his collar, dusted him off with exaggerated courtesy. "Now walk out of here like nothing happened. Go back to the saloon, drink your whiskey, but know that everything has changed." Felipe stumbled toward the stable entrance, his usual swagger replaced by unsteady steps. At the door, he turned back, finding Thomas already returning to his work, once again the picture of a simple stable hand. But now Felipe saw what they had all missed: the predatory grace in those movements, the controlled power in those hands, the deadly intelligence behind that practiced mask of innocence. As Felipe made his way back to the saloon, trying to compose himself, he realized with growing horror that they had invited death into their midst and called it harmless. They had mocked a wolf in sheep's clothing, and soon, very soon, they would pay the price for that mistake. In the stable, Thomas allowed himself a grim smile as he felt Felipe's retreating footsteps through the floorboards. The first piece had moved on the board, and with it, the careful game he had orchestrated for 3 years began its final phase. The Blackwood gang was about to learn that underestimating a man because of a perceived weakness wasn't just foolish, it was fatal. The truth about Thomas Matthews began to unravel like a frayed rope, strand by strand, in the hours following his confrontation with Felipe Cruz. Inside the marshal's office in far-off Denver, a dusty file told a different story, one of a decorated Army scout turned lawman whose profound hearing loss from a Civil War artillery blast had become his greatest asset rather than the limitation others assumed it to be. Martha Hawkins noticed the change in Felipe first when he returned to the saloon. The outlaw's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his whiskey glass, and his usual boisterous manner had been replaced by an uncharacteristic silence. She'd seen that look before, on men who'd stared death in the face and lived to tell about it. But when Marcus Blackwood demanded an account of what had happened in the stable, Felipe merely muttered something about checking the horses and finding everything in order. As dusk approached, Thomas continued his stable duties with methodical precision. Each movement served a dual purpose, maintaining his cover while positioning himself for what would come next. He felt the vibrations of approaching footsteps and recognized the distinct pattern: Martha Hawkins, her steady stride carrying the weight of untold burdens. "I brought you some supper," Martha announced, knowing he could read lips. She sat down, a plate on a hay bale, then carefully closed the stable door behind her. When she turned back, she found Thomas watching her with an intensity that confirmed what she'd long suspected. Felipe Cruz looked like he'd seen a ghost when he came back. Reckon you might know something about that. Thomas considered her for a long moment before responding, his voice carrying the refined tones of education rather than the awkward speech patterns he'd affected for years. Sometimes ghosts are exactly what men like Felipe need to see, Mrs. Hawkins. Martha didn't flinch at his sudden ability to speak. Instead, she pulled a folded newspaper from her apron, a 3-month-old edition from Kansas City. "Thought you might find this interesting," she said, handing it to him. "Story about a marshal who disappeared after tracking the Blackwood gang across 3 territories. Man who could read tracks like an Indian scout and move silent as a mountain lion. Lost his hearing in the war, but gained something else instead." Thomas scanned the article, his expression unchanging. "You've known for a while." "Suspected," Martha corrected. "The way you watched people, how you always seemed to know what was happening in town before anyone else. A deaf man learns to see what others miss, but you see more than most." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "They killed my Robert, you know, 3 years ago when they first came through. Said he drew on them, but Robert never carried a gun in his life." The revelation hung in the air between them. Thomas folded the newspaper deliberately, his movements precise. "I know, Mrs. Hawkins. It's in their pattern, establishing dominance in a new town by making an example of someone respected. Your husband was their first victim here, but not their last." Martha's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Sheriff Jensen wasn't just roughed up, was he?" "They killed him too." Thomas nodded grimly. "His body's in an abandoned mine shaft 3 miles north. They've been using it to dispose of anyone who gets too curious. The territorial governor has suspected for months that someone in his office was feeding information to the gang. That's why they sent me, someone who could gather evidence without raising suspicion." The stable fell silent, save for the soft shuffling of horses in their stalls. Martha studied the man before her, seeing past the carefully constructed facade to the weapon beneath. "How many?" she asked finally. "How many lives have they taken?" 27 that I can confirm," Thomas replied, his fingers unconsciously tracing the scar behind his right ear, a souvenir from Shiloh that had taken his hearing but given him a different kind of awareness. "But tomorrow that number stops growing." Martha straightened her spine, decision made. "What do you need from me?" "Keep serving drinks, keep watching, and when the time comes—" Thomas paused, ensuring she could read his lips clearly. "Make sure young Deputy Cooper stays out of the crossfire. The boy's got heart, but this isn't his fight." As Martha turned to leave, Thomas added softly, "Your husband was a good man, Mrs. Hawkins. What happens tomorrow won't bring him back, but it will ensure justice is served." After she left, Thomas returned to his evening routine, but his movements now carried an added purpose. In his small room above the stable, hidden beneath loose floorboards, lay the tools of his true profession: a custom Colt revolver modified for silent drawing, a marshal's badge that hadn't seen sunlight in 3 years, and a document listing every crime, every victim, every dark deed the Blackwood gang had committed. The sun finally disappeared behind the distant mountains, painting Rattlesnake Junction in deepening shadows. In the saloon, the Blackwood gang drank and laughed, unaware that their carefully constructed world was about to crumble. Felipe Cruz sat among them, jumping at every sudden movement, his eyes constantly drawn to the stable across the street where a supposed deaf man had shown him the true meaning of fear. As night settled over Rattlesnake Junction, the town's atmosphere grew thick with unspoken tension. In his private room above the Rusty Spur saloon, Marcus Blackwood sat at a worn oak table, methodically cleaning his revolver by lamplight. The weapon had taken 13 lives. He'd carved a notch for each one, though the true count was far higher. His fingers traced each groove with almost loving precision, unaware that his time for adding notches was rapidly drawing to a close. Below, in the saloon's main room, Ricardo Cruz watched his brother Felipe with growing concern. Something had changed in Felipe after his visit to the stable, something that went beyond mere unease. The younger Cruz brother had barely touched his whiskey, his usual boisterous nature, replaced by a haunted stillness that seemed to deepen with each passing hour. What really happened in that stable? Ricardo pressed, keeping his voice low. And don't feed me that horse-checking nonsense again. His hand unconsciously moved to the knife at his belt, a gesture that usually reassured him but now seemed inadequate against some unnamed threat. Felipe's eyes darted to the window, where the stable's dark silhouette loomed across the street. Nothing happened, he insisted, but his voice cracked on the words. Nothing that concerns us. We should leave, Ricardo, tonight. Make for Mexico while we still can. Ricardo leaned back, studying his brother's face in the dim lamplight. In 15 years of riding together, he'd never seen Felipe rattled like this, not during the Carson City bank robbery, not during their narrow escape from the territorial prison, not even when they'd left Sheriff Jensen's body in that abandoned mine shaft. Meanwhile, Thomas Matthews moved through the stable with deliberate purpose, every action, part of a carefully orchestrated plan. His heightened awareness, developed over years of compensating for his hearing loss, registered every vibration through the floorboards, every shift in the air currents, every shadow that crossed the gaps in the stable walls. He was mapping the night's choreography in his mind, positioning each piece for the coming confrontation. In her private quarters behind the saloon, Martha Hawkins retrieved a hidden strongbox from beneath a loose floorboard. Inside lay a derringer her husband had given her for protection, the same one she'd lacked the courage to use when the Blackwood gang had murdered him 3 years ago. Her hands were steady now as she loaded it, resolve hardening in her heart. Young Deputy Billy Cooper paced in his office, torn between duty and self-preservation. He'd seen the strange interaction between Felipe Cruz and the stable hand earlier, noticed the subtle shift in the town's atmosphere. His instincts, still developing but growing sharper, told him something momentous was building. He found himself repeatedly drawing and holstering his revolver, each time a little faster, knowing that tomorrow would test everything he thought he knew about courage and justice. Thomas felt the vibrations of approaching horsemen well before they appeared. 3 riders, moving fast and quiet, the kind of approach that spoke of professional killers rather than common bandits. He recognized the pattern. Reinforcements called in by Marcus Blackwood, insurance against whatever had spooked Felipe so badly. The pieces were moving faster than anticipated, but Thomas had planned for this contingency. These new arrivals were the Whitaker brothers, notorious hired guns known for their brutal efficiency. Their presence confirmed Thomas's suspicions that the Blackwood gang's operations extended far beyond simple robbery and extortion. They were part of a larger criminal network, one that had tendrils reaching into territorial government itself. From his vantage point in the stable's hayloft, Thomas watched the Whitakers dismount and make their way toward the saloon. Their arrival would force his hand, accelerate the timetable he'd so carefully constructed. But perhaps that was for the best. 3 years of waiting, watching, and gathering evidence had honed his patience to a razor's edge, but it had also taught him to recognize when the moment for action had arrived. He reached beneath the loose floorboard, where his true identity lay hidden. The badge caught the moonlight as he lifted it, the silver star unmarred despite the years of concealment. Next came the modified Colt, its grip worn smooth from countless hours of silent practice. Each bullet in its cylinder had been carefully chosen for a specific target. loaded in an order that matched the sequence of his planned retribution. In the saloon, Marcus Blackwood received the Whittaker brothers with calculated hospitality, but their presence sparked whispers among the patrons. Martha Hawkins served them drinks with steady hands, her eyes catching every detail of their weapons and positioning. She'd learned to read men like them during her years running the saloon, and what she read now spoke of impending violence. The night deepened toward midnight, and Rattlesnake Junction held its breath. Tomorrow would bring either justice or more bloodshed to add to the town's already dark history. But for now, the pieces continued their careful dance. Marshal Thomas, Matthews in his stable, the Blackwood gang in their saloon, and between them, a town's worth of accumulated sins waiting to be answered for. The first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of crimson when Thomas Matthews began his morning. Routine, though this time every movement carried deadly purpose beneath its familiar rhythm. The town stirred slowly, unaware that this particular sunrise would mark the beginning of a day that would become legend in Rattlesnake Junction. Marcus Blackwood emerged from his room above the saloon, dark circles beneath his eyes betraying a night of restless planning. The Whittaker brothers' arrival had shifted something in the careful balance of power he'd established, and Felipe's continued unease gnawed at his confidence. Standing on the balcony, his gaze fixed on the stable across the street, where he could see the supposed deaf stable hand going about his morning tasks. Inside the stable, Thomas methodically prepared each horse, his heightened awareness tracking every movement in the awakening town. His fingers brushed against the marshal's badge concealed beneath his vest, a reminder of the oath he'd taken and the justice too long delayed. The vibrations through the floorboards told him exactly when. Marcus Blackwood descended the saloon stairs, how the man's stride carried the weight of growing paranoia. Martha Hawkins opened the saloon early that morning, her movements precise as she arranged bottles and glasses with careful deliberation. The derringer pressed against her lower back seemed to burn with the weight of possibility and responsibility. She watched through the window as Thomas led a horse from the stable, noting how his seemingly awkward movements now revealed their true nature to her knowing eyes, the grace of a predator deliberately playing wounded prey. The Whittaker brothers emerged from their rented rooms at the boarding house, their synchronized movements speaking of years operating as a single, deadly unit. James Whittaker, the eldest, carried a Winchester rifle in addition to his revolvers. The younger twins, Samuel and Daniel, flanked him with the unconscious precision of practiced killers. Their presence on the street caused windows to close and doors to lock as townspeople sensed the approaching storm. Deputy Billy Cooper stood in the doorway of his office, coffee cup growing cold in his hands as he observed the morning's careful choreography. His young face showed the strain of increasing comprehension. Something was building, something beyond his experience or authority to control. His hand rested on his gun belt, though he knew instinctively that drawing his weapon would only hasten. Whatever violence approached, Thomas felt the changing pressures in the air, the subtle shifts in the town's normal patterns. The Whittaker brothers positioned themselves strategically, James taking up position on the hotel's covered porch, the twins spreading out to command different angles of the street. Their movements confirmed what Thomas had suspected. They weren't just hired guns, but military-trained professionals. Their presence suggested the corruption he'd been tracking reached higher than even he had imagined. Ricardo Cruz emerged from the saloon, practically dragging his brother Felipe with him. Felipe's face had taken on an ashen quality, his eyes constantly darting toward the stable. "Brother," he whispered urgently, "you don't understand. He's not what we thought. He's not—" But Ricardo silenced him with a sharp gesture as Marcus Blackwood approached. "Enough," Marcus growled, his patience clearly frayed. "Whatever's got you spooked, Felipe, ends today. James," he called to the eldest Whittaker, "take your brothers and pay our simple stable hand a visit. Show him what happens to folks who don't know their place in the natural order of things." Thomas, continuing his work in the stable, registered the approaching footsteps through the floorboards. 3 sets of boots, moving with military precision, the Whittaker brothers making their play. His hands never faltered in their tasks, but beneath the surface, every muscle tensed in readiness. The moment approached when 3 years of careful deception would explode into violence, and he found himself recalling his old commander's words from his army days. "The deaf scout sees what others miss because he listens with his whole body." Martha Hawkins watched from behind her bar as the Whittaker brothers crossed the street toward the stable. Her hand moved to the derringer at her back, though she knew her role was to watch and wait. The town seemed to hold its breath, as if even the wind recognized the approaching moment of revelation. In these last peaceful moments, Thomas allowed himself a brief reflection on the path that had led him here. His deafness, once seen as a career-ending injury, had transformed him into something unique in the annals of law enforcement, a marshal who could read a man's intentions in the shuffle of his feet, who could feel a drawn gun through the vibrations in the floor, who had turned his supposed disability into a deadly advantage. The Whittaker brothers reached the stable door, their shadows stretching across the threshold like bars of a cage. The time for playing the simple stable hand had ended. Now would come the reckoning, and Rattlesnake Junction would learn that sometimes the most dangerous man is the one you've been taught to pity. The confrontation erupted with the precision of a choreographed dance. As the Whittaker brothers entered the stable, Thomas Matthews continued brushing down a mare, his back turned to them in apparent obliviousness. James Whittaker positioned himself in the center, while the twins spread out to flank what they assumed was easy prey. "Time for a lesson in respect," James announced, though he knew the stable hand supposedly couldn't hear him. The statement was more for his brother's benefit, a ritual they'd performed countless times before. Samuel and Daniel exchanged knowing smirks, their hands hovering near their weapons. What happened next would be debated in saloons across the territory for years to come. As James reached to grab Thomas's shoulder, the seemingly helpless stable hand moved with liquid grace. The brush in his hand became a weapon, its wooden handle striking James's wrist with surgical precision at the exact point to trigger involuntary muscle release. The Winchester rifle clattered to the stable floor before James even registered the pain. Thomas pivoted, using James's own momentum to send him staggering into Samuel. The movement brought him face to face with Daniel, who had already drawn his revolver. But Thomas had anticipated this, reading the intention in the vibrations of Daniel's boots on the wooden floor seconds before. His left hand shot out, fingers striking precisely at Daniel's throat, disrupting his breathing just enough to throw off his aim. The first shot went wide, splintering wood above Thomas's head. The sound brought chaos to Rattlesnake Junction's main street as townspeople scattered for cover. But inside the stable, Thomas moved with deadly calm, each action calculated and precise. Samuel managed to disentangle himself from his eldest brother and drew his knife, its blade gleaming in the early morning light streaming through the stable windows. He lunged forward, expecting to find the advantage in close quarters. Instead, he found himself grasping at empty air as Thomas seemed to flow around the attack like water around a stone. James Whittaker, recovering his balance, reached for his backup revolver. "You're dead, boy," he snarled. But the words died in his throat as he met Thomas's eyes. Gone was the simple, eager-to-please expression of the deaf stable hand. In its place was something that made James's blood run cold, the calculating gaze of a predator who had finally tired of playing with its prey. Thomas moved again, this time allowing his true capabilities to show. His hands became blur of motion, striking pressure points and vital areas with devastating accuracy. Samuel's knife clattered to the floor as his arm went numb. Daniel, still struggling to regain his breath, found himself disarmed with a twist that nearly broke his wrist. James managed to draw his revolver, but before he could aim, Thomas closed the distance between them. His fingers found the nerve, cluster at the base of James's throat, applying precise pressure that sent the renowned gunman to his knees, weapon falling from nerveless fingers. 3 years, Thomas spoke, his voice carrying the refined tones of education that seemed impossible from a supposed stable hand. 3 years I've watched men like you come through this town, thinking your guns and your reputations made you invincible. He increased the pressure slightly, causing James to gasp. 3 years of watching you prey on those you thought couldn't fight back. Outside, Marcus Blackwood heard the commotion and began moving toward the stable, the crews, brothers close behind. But Martha Hawkins, watching from the saloon doorway, saw something that made her blood run cold. Thomas had positioned himself so that the morning sun would be directly in the eyes of anyone entering the stable from the street. Inside, the Whitaker brothers lay groaning on the stable floor, their fearsome reputation shattered by a man they'd dismissed as simple and harmless. Thomas retrieved their weapons with methodical care, his movements economical and precise. The badge hidden beneath his vest seemed to burn against his chest, a reminder of the oath he'd sworn to bring justice to the territories. Your reputation preceded you, Thomas continued, addressing the fallen brothers. Military trained, they said, best hired guns in 3 territories, but you forgot the first rule they teach you in the army: never underestimate your opponent. James Whitaker, his face pressed against the hay-strewn floor, managed to croak out, "Who are you?" Thomas allowed himself a small smile, though there was no warmth in it. Someone who learned long ago that being underestimated is the greatest advantage a man can have. He secured their weapons efficiently, using their own gun belts to bind their hands. The deaf stable boy everyone pitied or mocked, he saw everything, every crime, every threat, every act of violence, and now it's time for a reckoning. The sound of approaching footsteps reached the others' ears. Though Thomas felt them through the floorboards long before, Marcus Blackwood was coming, and with him the next phase of the confrontation would begin. But Thomas had planned for this, had positioned everything precisely. The Whitaker brothers had been the first piece to fall, but they wouldn't be the last. Marcus Blackwood reached the stable entrance, his confidence wavering as he took in the scene before him. The infamous Whitaker brothers lay bound and subdued on the floor, their fearsome reputation shattered like broken glass. The morning sun streamed through the stable doors behind him, creating a wall of light that made it difficult to see clearly into the shadowed interior. Thomas Matthews stood among the fallen men, his posture transformed. Gone was the perpetual stoop of the simple stable hand, replaced by the straight-backed bearing of a trained fighter. The morning light caught the edge of something silver beneath his vest, a badge that had waited 3 years to see daylight again. "Step inside, Mr. Blackwood," Thomas spoke, his clear, educated tone shocking Marcus as much as the fact that he spoke at all. "You and I have matters to discuss regarding a cavalry payroll wagon, 13 murdered miners, and a sheriff's body in an abandoned mine shaft." Marcus fought to maintain his composure, though his hand instinctively moved toward his revolver. The Cruz brothers flanked him, Ricardo's face twisted with rage, while Felipe remained pale and trembling. "Whatever game you're playing, boy," Marcus growled, "it ends now." "This was never a game," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated evidence and patient justice. "Though I understand why you'd think so. After all, who would suspect the deaf stable hand? Who would guard their words around? Someone they thought couldn't hear. Your men have been quite informative over the years." Outside the stable, a crowd began to gather at what they deemed a safe distance. Deputy Billy Cooper stood among them, his young face showing the dawning realization that he was witnessing something beyond his experience. Martha Hawkins watched from the saloon doorway, her hand resting near the hidden derringer, ready to play her part if needed. Marcus took another step forward, trying to use his bulk to intimidate. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, boy. I own this territory. One word from me and—" "And what?" Thomas interrupted, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to Marcus's. "Growing agitation. Your friends in the territorial governor's office will intervene, the same ones who've been taking their cut of your operations. I have their names too, Mr. Blackwood. Every transaction, every bribe, every conspiracy carefully documented over 3 years." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. His carefully constructed empire, built on violence and corruption, suddenly seemed as fragile as a house of cards. Behind him, Felipe Cruz let out a small, choked sound of despair. "Ricardo," Marcus commanded, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Kill him!" Ricardo Cruz drew his revolver with practiced speed, but Thomas had already begun moving. The weeks of watching Ricardo practice his quick draw had revealed a tell, the slight shift of weight to his left foot before drawing. Thomas dropped and rolled as the shot rang out, the bullet splintering wood where he had stood moments before. The next few seconds unfolded like a deadly dance. Thomas came up from his roll directly in front of Ricardo, his hands moving with devastating precision. One strike to the wrist sent Ricardo's gun spinning away. Another to the solar plexus drove the air from his lungs. A sweep of his leg took Ricardo's feet from under him, sending him crashing to the stable floor beside. The Whitaker brothers. Marcus drew his own weapon, but Thomas had already closed the distance between them. The notorious gang leader found himself staring into eyes that held not fear or uncertainty, but the calm certainty of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. "Your second mistake," Thomas said quietly, his hand locked around Marcus's gun, and with crushing force was assuming that deafness made me weak. "Your first mistake was thinking you could murder innocent people without consequences." The sound of approaching horses cut through the morning air. Reinforcements Marcus had stationed outside town as insurance. But Thomas's slight smile suggested this too had been anticipated, had perhaps even been counted upon. "Those would be the marshal's deputies I contacted last week," Thomas explained, smoothly disarming Marcus with a twist that left the gang leader gasping in pain. "They've been waiting for my signal. Everything you've built, Mr. Blackwood, every corrupt deal and act of violence is about to come crashing down." Felipe Cruz, watching his brother and leader subdued with almost contemptuous ease, finally broke. "He's a marshal!" he shouted to Marcus. "I tried to tell you. He's been playing us for 3 years, watching, gathering evidence. We never stood a chance." The words echoed through the stable as the sound of approaching lawmen grew closer. Justice, delayed but not denied, was finally coming to Rattlesnake Junction, delivered by the man everyone had underestimated, the silent observer who had turned his perceived weakness into his greatest strength. The arrival of the marshals. Deputies transformed the quiet morning into a carefully orchestrated operation. 6 seasoned lawmen rode into Rattlesnake Junction, their badges catching the early sunlight. Leading them was Chief Deputy Howard McAllister, a veteran of frontier law enforcement whose reputation for incorruptibility was known throughout the territory. Inside the stable, Thomas Matthews maintained his hold on Marcus Blackwood while addressing the subdued criminals. 3 years ago, the territorial governor's office suspected a conspiracy reaching into its highest levels. They needed someone who could investigate without raising suspicion, someone the criminals would underestimate and ignore. He adjusted his grip as Marcus attempted to resist. "They chose me precisely because of what you all considered a weakness." McAllister dismounted and entered the stable, taking in the scene with professional appreciation. The notorious Whitaker brothers lay bound and disarmed, Ricardo Cruz sprawled beside them, and the feared Marcus Blackwood himself restrained by the man everyone had dismissed as a simple stable hand. "Impressive work, Marshal Matthews," McAllister commented, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Your reports hardly did justice to the situation." He turned to his deputies. "Secure the prisoners. Carefully. These men are responsible for at least 27 confirmed murders across 3 territories." As the deputies moved to carry out their orders, Martha Hawkins approached the stable entrance. Her presence caused Thomas to focus on her lips as she spoke. "The documentation you requested is safe, Marshal. Everything I've witnessed over the past 3 years, every conversation overheard in my saloon, all recorded and dated as you asked." The revelation caused Marcus Blackwood's face to darken with comprehension. "The widow," he spat, "you've been working with her all along." "Mrs. Hawkins has been instrumental in building our case," Thomas confirmed, his voice carrying a note of respect. "After your gang murdered her husband, she chose to fight back in her own way. While you were busy watching me, thinking me harmless, she was recording your operations with remarkable detail." Deputy Billy Cooper arrived at the stable, his young face showing a mixture of awe and embarrassment. "Marshal, I had no idea. If I'd known." "You did exactly what was needed, Deputy," Thomas assured him. "Your presence, your apparent inability to challenge them, it all contributed to their sense of invulnerability. That overconfidence was essential to our operation." McAllister supervised as his deputies began leading the prisoners out. "We'll need statements from everyone," he announced to the gathering crowd of townspeople. "Marshal Matthews has documented an extensive conspiracy involving territorial officials, corrupt lawmen, and business leaders across 3 states." Felipe Cruz, being led away in handcuffs, turned back toward Thomas. "Yesterday in the stable, you could have ended it then. Why wait?" Thomas moved closer, ensuring Felipe could see his response clearly, because this was never about just capturing the Blackwood gang. It was about exposing the entire network of corruption. Your attempt to intimidate me provided the perfect opportunity to set the final phase in motion. The morning sun now stood fully above the horizon, illuminating Rattlesnake Junction with unforgiving clarity. Thomas finally removed his vest, revealing the marshal's badge that had remained hidden for 3 years. The silver star caught the light, seeming to symbolize the dawn of a new era for the town. Martha Hawkins approached Thomas, carrying a cup of coffee with honey, just as she'd brought him countless times before. "Robert would be proud," she said, referring to her late husband, "not just of bringing these men to justice, but of showing everyone that what others see as a weakness can become strength." McAllister rejoined them, his expression serious. "The territorial governor will want to see you in Denver, Marshal Matthews. This case will shake the entire region. Several prominent officials are already fleeing, but we have men waiting for them." Thomas nodded, watching as Marcus Blackwood was led toward the waiting prison wagon. 3 years of playing a role, of being dismissed and underestimated. Every mockery, every casual cruelty, it all served to make them careless, to make them reveal their secrets in front of the man they thought couldn't hear. The townspeople of Rattlesnake Junction gathered in growing numbers, watching as justice finally arrived in their town. Many wore expressions of amazement as they reconciled their image of the simple stable hand with the skilled lawman before them. Thomas Matthews had turned his supposed disability into an asset, his silence into a weapon, and his patience into the instrument of justice. Deputy Cooper, still processing the morning's events, asked the question that many were thinking. "How did you bear it, Marshal? 3 years of pretending, of enduring their contempt." Thomas's response carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Justice, Deputy Cooper, requires more than just a fast draw or a badge. Sometimes it requires the humility to be underestimated and the patience to wait for the right moment. My deafness wasn't a hindrance. It was the key that unlocked this entire case. As morning gave way to afternoon, Rattlesnake Junction transformed into a hub of investigative activity. Chief Deputy McAllister established a temporary headquarters in the marshal's office, where Thomas Matthews began the systematic presentation of his 3 years of accumulated evidence. The Blackwood Gang was merely the visible portion of a much larger criminal enterprise, Thomas explained, laying out meticulously organized documents across the office's broad desk. Their activities served as a distraction from the more sophisticated operations occurring at higher levels of territorial government. McAllister examined the evidence with growing concern. The documentation revealed an intricate network of corruption, judges who dismissed cases for a price, land office officials who falsified records, and territorial representatives who orchestrated elaborate schemes to defraud the government. This payment ledger, Thomas indicated, pointing to a leather-bound volume recovered from Marcus Blackwood's room, connects directly to Judge Harrison Whitman in Denver. He's been manipulating land claim disputes in favor of whoever offered the highest payment. The Blackwood Gang served as both enforcers and intermediaries. Martha Hawkins contributed her own evidence, presenting a carefully maintained journal of conversations overheard in her saloon. They grew careless over time, she explained, especially when drinking. Names were mentioned, deals were discussed, all in front of a simple widow they thought too frightened to act. Deputy Cooper, assigned to assist in organizing the investigation, marveled at the scope of the conspiracy. The abandoned mineshaft where they... He hesitated, glancing at Martha. Where they disposed of their victims. It's on land officially recorded as worthless. But according to these geological surveys, it contains one of the richest silver deposits in the territory. Thomas nodded grimly. Exactly. They murdered the original claim holders, falsified the records, and were preparing to discover the silver deposit once their network was fully in place. Sheriff Jensen discovered this part of their operation. That's why they had to eliminate him. Throughout the afternoon, more evidence emerged as McAllister's deputies conducted searches of the Blackwood Gang's properties. Hidden correspondence revealed connections to corrupt officials in 2 neighboring territories. Financial records documented a complex money laundering scheme involving several prominent banks. Your method was ingenious, Marshal Matthews, McAllister commented, reviewing a particularly detailed set of observations. Your supposed disability caused them to speak freely in your presence, never suspecting you could read lips and document their every word. Thomas paused in his organization of evidence, his expression thoughtful. They saw what they expected to see, a simple stable, and who couldn't hear their plans or understand their operations. My deafness became my greatest asset in gaining their trust, or rather, their dismissal. Martha, bringing coffee to the working lawman, added her perspective. They never questioned why a deaf stable hand could break and train horses so effectively, never wondered how someone supposedly simple could manage complex tasks with such precision. They saw only what confirmed their prejudices. As the afternoon progressed, telegraph messages arrived from Denver, confirming arrests at the highest levels of territorial government. Judge Whitman had been apprehended attempting to flee to Mexico. The territorial governor's chief advisor was found in possession of incriminating documents he had failed to destroy. 3 years of patience, Thomas reflected, watching through the office window as more deputies arrived to assist with the investigation. 3 years of watching them build their empire on the suffering of others. But today, that empire crumbles. Deputy Cooper, displaying growing confidence in his role, organized the evidence into categories for prosecution. The territorial prosecutor will need these organized by jurisdiction, he explained. Some of these crimes fall under federal authority. Thomas approved of the young deputy's initiative. This case will have repercussions far beyond Rattlesnake Junction. Every false claim, every corrupted judge, every manipulated election, it all gets exposed now. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the office windows as the full scope of Thomas Matthews' investigation became clear. What had appeared to be a simple operation to capture a notorious gang had evolved into one of the largest corruption investigations in territorial history. "Your reputation will change after this, Marshal," McAllister observed. "No one will underestimate you again." Thomas's response carried a hint of irony. Perhaps. But there will always be those who see deafness as weakness, who judge by what they think they know rather than what is, and sometimes that prejudice becomes their undoing. The late afternoon brought waves of change to Rattlesnake Junction as news of the investigation's scope spread throughout the territory. Telegraph operators worked continuously, transmitting arrest orders and receiving confirmations of apprehensions. Across 3 states, the quiet frontier town had become the epicenter of a judicial earthquake that threatened to reshape the entire territorial power structure. In the marshal's office, Thomas Matthews and Chief Deputy McAllister reviewed reports of additional arrests. Judge Carlton, who had often ruled in favor of the Blackwood Gang's interests, was found attempting to destroy documents in his chambers. The territorial bank examiner, deeply implicated in the money laundering scheme, had surrendered himself to authorities in Denver rather than face the mounting evidence against him. "The territorial governor has declared a state of emergency," McAllister announced, reading from a newly arrived telegram. "Federal marshals are being dispatched to secure government offices and prevent any further destruction of evidence. The corruption appears to extend even further than your investigation initially suggested." Thomas nodded, his trained eyes reading the subtle movements of McAllister's lips as he spoke. The Blackwood Gang's operations were deliberately visible, drawing attention away from the more sophisticated criminal enterprises. While law enforcement focused on their violent activities, the real corruption flourished in courthouses and government offices. Martha Hawkins arrived with fresh coffee for the lawman, her presence a reminder of how ordinary citizens had suffered under the corrupt regime. "News is spreading through town," she reported. "Several prominent businessmen who dealt with the Blackwood Gang have already fled, leaving their establishments abandoned." "Let them run," Thomas responded, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had planned for every contingency. "We have documentation of every transaction, every partnership, every illegal agreement. Running only adds to their guilt." Deputy Cooper entered the office, carrying additional evidence recovered from the abandoned mine shaft where Sheriff Jensen's body had been found. "Marshal, we discovered a hidden compartment containing more financial records. The gang wasn't just hiding bodies in that mine. They were using it to store evidence of their broader operations." The young deputy's discovery prompted Thomas to reveal another aspect of his investigation. The mine shaft wasn't chosen at random. It's part of a larger pattern of land fraud that extends throughout the territory. They murdered claim holders, falsified records, and then used the properties for their illegal operations. McAllister examined the newly discovered documents with growing concern. This goes beyond ordinary corruption. They were building a shadow government, controlling everything from land rights to water access. The Blackwood Gang's violence was just a tool to maintain control through fear. Outside the marshal's office, the town showed signs of transformation. Citizens walked more freely in the streets, no longer fearful of the gang's presence. Several members of the town council, those not implicated in the corruption, had called an emergency meeting to begin rebuilding the town's legitimate government. Thomas observed these changes through the office window, his enhanced visual awareness, catching subtle details others might miss. 3 years of watching this town suffer under their control, he reflected, but fear and corruption create their own weaknesses. They became so confident in their power that they never questioned why a deaf stable hand could manage their horses so effectively. Martha, who had been reviewing her journals of overheard conversations, identified another pattern. They discussed their operations openly in my saloon, assuming no one would dare testify against them. Their arrogance became their vulnerability. The investigation continued to expand as more evidence emerged. Telegraph messages arrived regularly, reporting arrests across the territory. The carefully constructed network of corruption was unraveling rapidly, each arrest leading to new revelations and further indictments. The territorial prosecutor is assembling a special grand jury, McAllister announced, reading another telegram. They're treating this as the largest criminal conspiracy in territorial history. Your evidence, Marshal Matthews, has initiated a complete overhaul of territorial government. Thomas's response demonstrated the strategic thinking that had characterized his 3-year investigation. The conspiracy's strength was also its weakness. By spreading their corruption so widely, they created too many potential points of failure. One thread pulled loose, and the entire tapestry begins to unravel. As evening approached, the implications of the day's events continued to ripple outward. The Blackwood Gang's reign of terror had ended, but the true impact of Thomas Matthews' patient investigation was only beginning to emerge. The territory stood on the brink of fundamental change, all because of a marshal who had turned his perceived disability into an extraordinary advantage in the pursuit of justice. As dusk settled over Rattlesnake Junction, the full weight of the day's revelations began to settle upon the town. The marshal's office transformed into a processing center as deputies catalogued evidence and recorded testimonies from citizens finally free to speak about the corruption they had witnessed. Thomas Matthews sat at the sheriff's old desk, methodically documenting the detailed chronology of his 3-year investigation. His written report revealed the extraordinary depth of his observational skills, enhanced rather than hindered by his deafness. Every gesture, every facial expression, every subtle movement he had witnessed contributed to the overwhelming body of evidence. The Territorial Prosecutor's Office has dispatched a team of legal experts, Chief Deputy McAllister informed him, ensuring he faced Thomas directly to facilitate lip reading. They're particularly interested in your documentation of Judge Whitman's involvement in the land fraud schemes. Thomas nodded, continuing his writing. The judge's participation was crucial to their operation. He provided legal cover for their activities, manipulating land claims and dismissing cases that threatened to expose their operations. His personal ledger, which we recovered from Marcus Blackwood's quarters, provides irrefutable evidence of judicial corruption. Deputy Cooper entered the office, carrying additional witness statements from townspeople. The young lawman had grown noticeably more confident since the morning's revelations, his earlier uncertainty replaced by purposeful dedication to the investigation. "Several merchants have come forward, Marshal," Cooper reported. "They're providing details about the protection schemes the Blackwood Gang operated. The payment records match perfectly with Mrs. Hawkins' documentation of conversations overheard in the saloon." Martha Hawkins, who had become an informal headquarters coordinator, organized the incoming statements with practiced efficiency. "The pattern becomes clear when you see it all laid out," she observed. They started small, with simple protection rackets, then gradually expanded into more sophisticated operations. Most people never saw the larger picture. Thomas paused in his writing, his expression thoughtful. That was their strategy: keep people focused on the immediate threats, the visible violence of the Blackwood Gang, while the real corruption spread through legitimate institutions. Even law enforcement focused on the obvious crimes, missing the deeper conspiracy. Outside, the town had taken on an almost celebratory atmosphere as citizens began to grasp the magnitude of their liberation. The Rusty Spur Saloon, once a hub of criminal activity, now served as a gathering place for people sharing their stories and experiences under the gang's regime. McAllister reviewed the latest telegrams from Denver, which detailed the expanding investigation. Federal authorities are involved now. The connection to territorial government corruption has elevated this beyond local jurisdiction. Your patience in building this case, Marshal Matthews, has exposed far more than just a criminal gang. Thomas's response revealed the strategic thinking behind his long-term undercover operation. The key was allowing them to believe in their own invulnerability. My perceived disability made me invisible to them. They never suspected that their casual conversations, their unguarded moments, were being carefully documented by someone they had dismissed as simple and harmless. Martha brought fresh coffee, her movement through the office comfortable and purposeful. They created their own downfall, she noted, their contempt for those they considered beneath them, a deaf stable, and a widow running a saloon, blinded them to the very people who would expose their crimes. The evening deepened, but the work continued. Deputies organized evidence for transport to Denver, where federal prosecutors waited to begin building their cases. The corruption that had seemed invincible that morning now lay exposed and vulnerable, its powerful practitioners reduced to common criminals awaiting justice. The territorial governor has authorized additional resources for the investigation, McAllister announced, reading another telegram. They're treating this as a priority case, with implications for the entire justice system in the Western Territories. Thomas finally completed his initial report, the detailed document representing 3 years of patient observation and careful planning. This is just the beginning, he noted, his voice carrying the weight of experience. The corruption we've exposed here has roots in other territories, other jurisdictions. What started in Rattlesnake Junction will lead to investigations throughout the western frontier. As night settled over the town, the transformation was already visible. Citizens walked the streets freely, without the fear that had characterized life under the Blackwood Gang's regime. The quiet strength of justice, personified by a marshal who had turned his supposed weakness into an extraordinary strength, had begun to heal the wounds of corruption and violence. As midnight approached in Rattlesnake Junction, the investigation uncovered layers of corruption that extended far beyond the initial scope. In the marshal's office, Thomas Matthews and Chief Deputy McAllister examined a series of coded ledgers, discovered in a hidden compartment beneath the saloon's floorboards. These entries represent more than simple criminal transactions, Thomas explained, his fingers tracing the carefully disguised notations. They document a systematic effort to undermine legitimate government throughout the territory. The Blackwood Gang's violent activities served as a smokescreen for more sophisticated operations. The ledgers revealed an intricate network of political manipulation. Several territorial legislators had accepted substantial bribes to influence land acquisition laws. Banking officials had facilitated complex money laundering schemes disguised as legitimate business transactions. Even the Territorial Surveyor's Office had been compromised, altering official maps to support fraudulent land claims. McAllister studied the documents with growing concern. The implications are staggering. They weren't just corrupting the system, they were reshaping it to serve their interests. Every legitimate institution was being slowly transformed into a tool for their criminal enterprise. Martha Hawkins contributed additional context from her years of careful observation. They discussed their plans openly in my saloon, believing no one would dare oppose them. Their conversations revealed a level of influence that reached into the highest offices of territorial government. Thomas nodded, his expression grave. Their greatest vulnerability was their certainty of invulnerability. They never considered that someone they dismissed as disabled could comprehend, let alone document, the full scope of their operations. Deputy Cooper arrived with reports from the ongoing searches of Blackwood Gang properties. "Marshal, we've discovered correspondence linking Judge Whitman to land speculation schemes in 2 neighboring territories. The criminal enterprise extends beyond our jurisdiction." The evidence painted a picture of methodical corruption. The gang had established a network of compromised officials who facilitated their operations while maintaining a facade of legitimate authority. Their influence extended from local law enforcement to territorial courts, creating a system that protected their interests while suppressing any opposition. "The Territorial Governor's Office has requested federal intervention," McAllister announced, reading from a newly arrived telegram. "The scope of corruption threatens the stability of territorial government itself. Your investigation, Marshal Matthews, has exposed vulnerabilities in the entire system of frontier justice." Thomas's response reflected his deep understanding of human nature. They built their power on assumptions about strength and weakness. My supposed disability made me invisible to them, the perfect position from which to observe their operation. They never questioned why a deaf stable hand could manage their horses with such skill, never wondered about my ability to anticipate their needs without verbal communication. Martha brought fresh coffee as the investigation continued through the night. "They created their own downfall through their arrogance," she observed. "Their contempt for those they considered beneath them. A deaf stable hand, a widow running, a saloon, blinded them to the very people who would expose their crimes." The investigation revealed how the Blackwood Gang had systematically eliminated any potential opposition. Sheriff Jensen's murder was part of a larger pattern of intimidation and violence directed at anyone who threatened to expose their activities. The abandoned mineshaft where his body was found contained evidence of other victims who had opposed their operations. Their control was nearly complete, Thomas noted, reviewing the accumulated evidence. They had corrupted or intimidated every official who might have challenged their authority. Only their assumption that certain people were beneath their notice allowed us to gather the evidence needed to dismantle their organization. As the investigation deepened, the full impact of Thomas Matthews' patient strategy became clear. His perceived disability had created the perfect cover for a comprehensive investigation that would have been impossible through conventional law enforcement methods. The very prejudices that led people to underestimate him had become the tool of their undoing. The night continued, filled with the steady work of documenting crimes and recording testimonies. Each piece of evidence revealed new connections, new aspects of corruption that had remained hidden beneath the surface of frontier society. The transformation of Rattlesnake Junction from a town controlled by fear to a center of justice continued, driven by the quiet determination of a marshal who had turned prejudice into an advantage in the service of justice. The first rays of sunrise brought new developments to Rattlesnake Junction's transformation. Thomas Matthews stood at the marshal's office window, observing the changing dynamics in the town's awakening. The atmosphere had shifted noticeably from the previous day, as if the town itself was emerging from a long shadow. Chief Deputy McAllister entered with reports from the overnight developments. "Federal marshals have secured the territorial offices in Denver," he reported, positioning himself so Thomas could read his lips clearly. "The evidence you gathered has initiated investigations in 3 neighboring territories. The corruption appears more extensive than initially suspected." The morning's telegrams detailed a cascade of arrests and revelations. Several prominent bankers had surrendered themselves to authorities, offering testimony about their roles in the financial aspects of the criminal enterprise. Their statements corroborated the evidence Thomas had meticulously gathered during his 3-year undercover operation. The territorial bank examiner's confession proves particularly significant, Thomas noted, reviewing the latest reports. His testimony confirms the systematic nature of the financial fraud. The Blackwood gang's violent activities provided cover for sophisticated banking schemes that depleted territorial resources. Martha Hawkins arrived with her morning report of the town's response to recent events. People are speaking openly now about experiences they've kept hidden for years, she explained. The fear that controlled this town is dissolving, replaced by a desire for justice and accountability. Deputy Cooper, who had maintained an overnight watch, provided updates. On the secured prisoners, Marcus Blackwood attempted to send a message to his contacts in Denver, he reported. The intercepted communication reveals additional conspirators within the territorial legislature. Thomas nodded, unsurprised by this development. Their network relied on layers of protection. Each revelation exposes new connections, new participants in the corruption. The challenge now becomes preserving the evidence and ensuring proper legal procedures are followed. The investigation had revealed how the criminal enterprise had systematically undermined legitimate authority. Through a combination of violence, intimidation, and financial manipulation, they had created a shadow government that served their interests while maintaining a facade of legitimate administration. The Territorial Prosecutor's Office has assigned a special team to handle these cases, McAllister announced, reading from a recent telegram. They're particularly interested in your documentation methods, Marshal Matthews. Your ability to record detailed observations while maintaining your cover has provided unusually compelling evidence. Thomas's response reflected the strategic thinking behind his long-term operation. My deafness became an unexpected advantage in gathering evidence. They discussed their operations freely in my presence, never considering that I could understand their conversations through lip reading. Their assumption of my disability created opportunities for observation that would have been impossible otherwise. The morning brought a steady stream of citizens offering additional testimony. Each statement added detail to the comprehensive picture of corruption that had controlled the territory. The evidence revealed how the criminal enterprise had exploited every weakness in the frontier justice system. The federal investigation will likely continue for months, Thomas explained to the assembled law enforcement team. The corruption we've exposed extends beyond criminal activities into the fundamental structure of territorial governance. Each arrest, each piece of evidence reveals new aspects of their operation. Martha, who had become an essential coordinator of the investigation's logistics, organized the incoming testimonies with practiced efficiency. The pattern becomes clearer with each new statement, she observed. They created a system where honest citizens felt powerless to resist their influence. Only by working together, sharing information and supporting each other, could we gather the evidence needed to dismantle their organization. As the morning progressed, Thomas received word that federal prosecutors were preparing extensive indictments based on his evidence. The careful documentation of his observations, combined with physical evidence and witness testimonies, had created an insurmountable case against the corrupt network. This marks the beginning of significant changes in territorial law enforcement, McAllister noted. Your investigation, Marshal Matthews, has exposed vulnerabilities that require systematic reform. The assumption that disability implies weakness has been thoroughly disproven by your work. The transformation of Rattlesnake Junction continued as citizens reclaimed their town from the shadow of corruption. The morning brought not just physical changes, but a shift in the community's understanding of strength, justice, and the nature of true capability. The midday sun cast stark shadows across Rattlesnake Junction as the investigation entered a critical phase. Thomas Matthews sat at his desk in the marshal's office, meticulously reviewing the consolidated evidence that would form the foundation of the federal prosecution's case against the corrupt network. The weight of 3 years' worth of careful observation and documentation spread before him in carefully organized files. Chief Deputy McAllister entered with urgent news from the territorial capital. The governor has declared a state of emergency in response to the scope of corruption we've uncovered, he reported, ensuring Thomas could clearly see his face. Federal authorities are implementing unprecedented measures to secure government institutions and prevent further destruction of evidence. They're dispatching additional marshals to every major settlement in the territory. The investigation had revealed systematic manipulation of territorial institutions that exceeded initial assessments. Documents recovered from Marcus Blackwood's hidden archives detailed an intricate network of influence that had compromised every level of frontier governance. The evidence pointed to a conspiracy far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The evidence suggests a deliberate strategy to undermine legitimate authority, Thomas explained, indicating specific entries in the recovered ledgers. They identified key positions within territorial government and systematically corrupted or replaced officials who might have opposed their operations. Their method was remarkably thorough. They didn't just bribe officials, they created a system where honest men couldn't survive in positions of authority. Martha Hawkins contributed additional insights from her years of careful observation. They created a system where honest citizens felt trapped, she noted, placing another stack of witness statements on Thomas's desk. Every attempt to seek justice through official channels led back to their corrupted network. They controlled not just through violence, but through the manipulation of legitimate institutions. Even those who wanted to stand against them found themselves isolated and vulnerable. Deputy Cooper arrived with reports from the ongoing interrogation of detained gang members. The young lawman's demeanor had transformed over the past day, showing a new confidence born of purpose and vindication. Several of the Blackwood gang's lower-ranking members have agreed to provide testimony, he announced, his voice steady with professional pride. Their statements corroborate Marshal Matthews' documented observations and reveal additional details about the organization's structure. More importantly, they're identifying corrupted officials we hadn't previously suspected. The investigation had exposed how the criminal enterprise maintained its control through a carefully balanced combination of violent intimidation and sophisticated manipulation of legal systems. The Blackwood gang's visible activities had served as a smokescreen for more insidious corruption within territorial institutions. Each new piece of evidence revealed additional layers of complexity in their operation. The federal prosecutors are particularly interested in your documentation of judicial corruption, McAllister noted, reviewing the latest communications from Denver. Your ability to record detailed observations of Judge Whitman's activities while maintaining your cover has provided crucial evidence for the prosecution. The judge's personal ledger, combined with your observations of his meetings in the stable, creates an insurmountable case. Thomas's response reflected his deep understanding of human nature and criminal psychology. Their assumption of my disability created opportunities for observation that would have been impossible through conventional investigation methods, he explained, his voice carrying the weight of years of patient observation. They never considered that someone they dismissed as impaired could comprehend, let alone document, the complexity of their operations. Their prejudice became their vulnerability. The afternoon brought additional developments as federal authorities expanded their investigation into neighboring territories. The evidence Thomas had gathered during his 3-year undercover operation revealed connections to criminal enterprises throughout the western frontier. Each new discovery expanded the scope of the investigation, suggesting a criminal network that spanned hundreds of miles and involved dozens of corrupted officials. The transformation of Rattlesnake Junction continued as citizens began to reclaim their town from the shadow of corruption. The streets buzzed with activity as people moved about freely, no longer constrained by fear of the Blackwood Gang's surveillance. The change was palpable in the way people walked, talked, and carried themselves. A weight had been lifted from the town's collective shoulders. As the afternoon progressed, Thomas observed these changes from his office window, recognizing that this was more than just the culmination of his investigation. It represented a fundamental shift in how justice would be administered in the territories. His success had demonstrated that true strength often came disguised as weakness, and that assumptions about capability could blind people to the presence of justice in their midst. The late afternoon brought an unprecedented level of federal activity to Rattlesnake Junction as the investigation expanded to its fullest scope. A contingent of 20 federal marshals arrived from Denver, their polished badges catching the setting sun as they rode into town in perfect formation. Thomas Matthews observed their arrival from the marshal's office, noting how their disciplined presence stood in stark contrast to the chaotic corruption they had come to dismantle. Chief Deputy McAllister coordinated with the federal authorities, establishing a comprehensive system for processing the mounting evidence. The Justice Department has assigned their most experienced prosecutors to this case, he reported to Thomas, ensuring his face remained clearly visible for lip reading. They recognize that this investigation represents a pivotal moment in territorial law enforcement. Your methodical documentation over these 3 years has provided them with an unprecedented opportunity to address systemic corruption at its roots. The federal response demonstrated the gravity of the situation. Teams of specialized investigators began systematic searches of government offices throughout the territory, guided by the detailed evidence Thomas had accumulated during his undercover operation. Each new search yielded additional documentation of corruption, confirming the vast extent of the criminal network's influence. The pattern becomes clearer with each new discovery, Thomas explained to the assembled law enforcement officials during their first coordinated briefing. They established a parallel system of governance, using legitimate institutions as a mere facade for their criminal enterprises. The territorial bank examiner's records, for instance, reveal an intricate web of financial manipulation that extends far beyond simple theft or fraud. They created a sophisticated system designed to appear legitimate while facilitating extensive money laundering operations. Martha Hawkins, whose role had evolved from saloon keeper to crucial investigative coordinator, continued to provide vital support to the operation. Her years of careful observation added essential context to the documented evidence. They created an atmosphere where resistance seemed not just futile, but impossible, she noted, organizing another substantial set of witness statements. Every official who showed even a hint of integrity found themselves systematically isolated and vulnerable. The few brave souls who tried to stand against them discovered that the very institutions meant to support justice had been turned against them, leaving them with nowhere to turn for help. Deputy Cooper, now working alongside the federal marshals, reported on the ongoing interrogations that had continued through the day. The Whitaker brothers have begun providing detailed testimony, he announced, his voice carrying new authority. Their military background offers us a unique perspective on the organization's structure and operations. They're identifying corrupt officials we hadn't previously connected to the conspiracy, including several high-ranking territorial administrators who managed to maintain clean public images. The federal investigation revealed the ingenious, yet disturbing way the criminal enterprise had exploited the inherent weaknesses in frontier justice systems. Through a carefully orchestrated combination of violence, strategic bribery, and sophisticated manipulation of legal processes, they had created a network that seemed impenetrable to conventional law enforcement methods. Your approach to gathering evidence was nothing short of revolutionary, noted Federal Marshal James Harrison, who had arrived to personally oversee the operation. By using their assumptions about your disability to your advantage, you were able to document criminal activities that would have been impossible to observe through traditional methods. This case will likely transform our entire approach to undercover operations and challenge our preconceptions about what makes an effective law enforcement officer. Thomas's response demonstrated the deep understanding of human nature that had made his investigation possible. Their absolute confidence in their own superiority became their greatest weakness, he explained, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years of patient observation. They never questioned why a deaf stable hand could manage their horses so effectively, never wondered about my ability to anticipate their needs without verbal communication. Their prejudice created blind spots that allowed me to observe and document their activities without raising the slightest suspicion. In their arrogance, they built their own downfall. The afternoon progressed with a steady flow of new developments as federal agents secured additional evidence from compromised government offices throughout the territory. The growing documentation revealed a criminal enterprise that had systematically undermined legitimate authority while maintaining a carefully constructed facade of proper governance. The territorial governor has authorized extraordinary measures, McAllister reported, reading from the latest telegrams that arrived in rapid succession. Every land claim, every judicial decision, every financial transaction connected to the corrupted officials will be subject to comprehensive review. The scope of this investigation will likely reshape the entire structure of territorial administration. As evening approached, Thomas conducted a detailed review of the day's developments with the federal authorities. The evidence he had gathered during his undercover operation had initiated a cascade of revelations that would fundamentally change how justice was administered in the territories. His patient strategy of turning perceived weakness into strength had exposed corruption that conventional law enforcement had been unable to touch. The federal marshals established secure protocols for transporting prisoners and evidence to Denver, where grand jury proceedings would begin within the week. The careful documentation Thomas had maintained throughout his investigation would provide the foundation for prosecutions that would likely continue for months, if not years, fundamentally transforming the administration of justice throughout the Western Territories. The next morning brought a transformative moment to Rattlesnake Junction as federal authorities prepared for the mass transfer of prisoners to Denver. Thomas Matthews stood on the marshal's office porch, observing the coordinated operation with careful attention to detail. The morning sun illuminated a scene that marked the culmination of his 3-year mission, yet also signaled the beginning of a broader transformation in territorial justice. Chief Deputy McAllister approached with the final transfer documentation, requiring Thomas's review and signature. The federal courthouse in Denver has cleared its docket to begin proceedings immediately, he reported, positioning himself for optimal communication. The territorial prosecutor believes the evidence you've gathered presents an unprecedented opportunity to address systemic corruption throughout the Western Territories. The transfer operation demonstrated remarkable precision. Federal marshals had positioned armed guards strategically throughout the town, establishing a secure corridor from the jail to the waiting prison wagons. The Blackwood gang members, The Whittaker brothers and the various corrupted officials would be transported under heavy guard to face justice in Denver. The security measures reflect the significance of these prisoners, Thomas explained to Deputy Cooper, who watched the proceedings with studied attention. These men don't just represent common criminals. They embody a system of corruption that has infiltrated every level of territorial governance. Their successful prosecution will mark a turning point in frontier justice. Martha Hawkins had arranged for her saloon to serve as a temporary command center for the federal marshals, transforming the space where corruption once flourished into a headquarters for justice. "There's a certain poetry to it," she observed, organizing the final set of witness statements. "The very location where they plotted their crimes now serves as the base for their downfall. Every corner of this room holds memories of conversations they never thought would come to light." The morning's activities drew crowds of townspeople, gathering at a respectful distance to witness the dismantling of the power structure that had controlled their lives for so long. Thomas noted the change in their bearing. The fear that had kept heads down and voices quiet had been replaced by a cautious optimism. Federal Marshal Harrison oversaw the prisoner transfer preparations personally. "Your documentation presents a comprehensive picture of corruption that extends far beyond criminal activities," he commented to Thomas. "You've exposed fundamental flaws in how we've approached law enforcement in the territories. Your methods challenge our basic assumptions about gathering evidence and conducting long-term investigations." The investigation had revealed patterns of corruption that would require systematic reform to address. Thomas's careful documentation showed how the criminal enterprise had exploited weaknesses in territorial governance, using legitimate institutions as cover for their illegal operations. Each piece of evidence demonstrated the sophisticated nature of their corruption. The Territorial Governor's Office has initiated a complete review of all government appointments, McAllister reported, reading from the latest communications from Denver. "Your evidence has prompted a fundamental reassessment of how we verify the integrity of territorial officials. The ripple effects of this investigation will transform administrative procedures throughout the Western Territories." Deputy Cooper, who had grown considerably in his understanding of law enforcement over the past days, provided an update on the final prisoner preparations. "The Whittaker brothers have agreed to provide complete testimony about their military connections," he reported. "Their information suggests corruption within the Army contracting system that requires federal investigation." Thomas's patient strategy had exposed corruption that conventional law enforcement methods could never have touched. His perceived disability, which many had dismissed as a limitation, had provided the perfect cover for gathering evidence that would have been impossible to obtain through traditional means. "Your success challenges our understanding of effective law enforcement," Marshal Harrison noted. "By turning their prejudices against them, you've demonstrated that true investigative ability relies more on observation and patience than physical capabilities. This case will likely become a model for future undercover operations." As the morning progressed, the prisoners were systematically transferred to the waiting wagons. Marcus Blackwood, once the embodiment of corrupt power in Rattlesnake Junction, now stood shackled alongside the officials he had corrupted. The Whittaker brothers, their military bearing intact even in defeat, maintained a dignified silence that suggested their acceptance of changing circumstances. Thomas watched the proceedings with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his entire investigation. Each movement, each secured prisoner, represented another step toward justice. His ability to read situations without relying on sound had become his greatest strength, allowing him to observe and document criminal activities that others would have missed. The federal marshals established a protective escort formation around the prison wagons. The transfer to Denver would require careful coordination to prevent any attempts at prisoner liberation. The evidence Thomas had gathered would travel separately, protected by additional security measures to ensure its safe delivery to federal prosecutors. Martha approached Thomas as the final preparations concluded. "The town will need time to heal," she observed, "but you've given us something we'd almost forgotten: hope for justice. Your patience showed us that sometimes the quietest voice speaks the loudest truth." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Rattlesnake Junction as the prison wagons disappeared over the horizon, carrying their cargo of corruption toward Denver's federal courthouse. Thomas Matthews stood in front of the marshal's office, his keen eyes taking in the transformed atmosphere of the town he had served in silence for 3 years. The subtle changes in citizens' bearing and movement told him more than words ever could about the profound transformation taking place. Chief Deputy McAllister approached with a comprehensive report detailing the full scope of the investigation's impact. The federal prosecutors estimate the trials will continue for at least 6 months, he explained, ensuring clear visibility for Thomas's lip reading. "Your evidence has exposed corruption extending into 3 territories, implicating over 40 government officials and revealing systematic abuse of power at every level of frontier administration. The prosecutors believe this case will set precedents for future corruption investigations throughout the Western Territories." The investigations' ripple effects continued to spread throughout the territory with remarkable speed and impact. Telegraph messages arrived regularly, reporting the arrest of corrupted officials who had attempted to flee upon hearing news of the Blackwood Gang's fall. Each arrest confirmed the extensive nature of the criminal network Thomas had helped expose, and each new piece of evidence strengthened the case against the entire corrupt system. "The territorial governor has initiated a complete restructuring of law enforcement procedures," McAllister continued, reviewing the latest communications from Denver. "Your methods have prompted a fundamental reassessment of how we approach long-term investigations. The success of your undercover operation challenges traditional assumptions about effective law enforcement techniques. They're particularly interested in your methods of documentation and observation, which proved more effective than conventional surveillance approaches." Martha Hawkins, whose role in documenting the corruption had proven invaluable, provided insight into the town's transformation. "People speak differently now," she observed, watching citizens move freely through the streets. "The weight of fear has lifted. They walk taller, speak more openly, and look each other in the eye again. Your patience showed them that justice, though delayed, remains possible. Even the children play more freely in the streets, no longer hushed by parents fearful of drawing attention." Deputy Cooper, whose growth through the investigation had been remarkable, reported on the continuing collection of witness statements. "More people come forward each day," he explained, his voice carrying new authority. "Your success has given them courage to share their experiences. Each testimony adds detail to the picture of corruption you helped expose. We're learning about incidents and connections that extend back years, creating a comprehensive record of how the corruption took root and spread." The federal investigation had revealed how the criminal enterprise manipulated every aspect of territorial governance with sophisticated precision. Through careful documentation, Thomas had exposed a system where corruption didn't merely exist within institutions. It had become the institution itself, with legitimate authority serving merely as a facade for criminal activities. His evidence showed how they had systematically undermined every safeguard meant to protect honest citizens. "Your investigation represents more than just the capture of criminals," Federal Marshal Harrison noted during his final briefing. "You've exposed fundamental flaws in how we've approached frontier justice. Your success demonstrates that effective law enforcement requires patience, observation, and the ability to see beyond surface appearances. The methods you've developed will likely become standard practice for long-term undercover operations. Thomas's methodical approach had created an unprecedented body of evidence that would serve as a foundation for widespread reform. His careful documentation detailed not just individual crimes, but the entire structure of corruption that had dominated the territory. Each piece of evidence revealed another aspect of how the criminal enterprise had maintained its control through a sophisticated combination of violence, intimidation, and manipulation of legal systems. The transformation of Rattlesnake Junction continued as citizens reclaimed their town from the shadow of corruption. Businesses reopened without fear of extortion. Miners returned to their claims, knowing their rights would be protected, and the town council began the process of rebuilding legitimate governance. The change was visible in every aspect of daily life, from the increased activity in the streets to the open discussions in public spaces. Martha's Saloon, once a hub of criminal activity, had become a symbol of the town's transformation. Every corner of this place holds memories of their corruption, she reflected, surveying the now bustling establishment. But now it stands as a testament to justice's triumph. Your patience showed us that sometimes the strongest response to corruption is the quiet persistence of truth. The conversations here now focus on hope and future plans rather than fear and submission. As evening approached, Thomas reviewed the final reports documenting the investigation's scope. His 3 years of careful observation had exposed not just a criminal gang, but an entire system of corruption that had seemed impenetrable to conventional law enforcement methods. His success demonstrated that true strength often lay in patience, observation, and the ability to turn perceived weakness into unexpected advantage. The legacy of Thomas Matthews' investigation would extend far beyond the capture of the Blackwood gang. His methods had revealed new possibilities in law enforcement, challenging assumptions about ability and effectiveness. The transformation of Rattlesnake Junction from a town controlled by fear to a symbol of justice's triumph would serve as a model for other communities struggling against corruption, proving that even the most entrenched criminal enterprises could be dismantled through patience, observation, and unwavering dedication to justice. As sunset approached on that pivotal day in Rattlesnake Junction, Thomas Matthews sat at the marshal's office desk, composing his final official report on the 3-year investigation. The document would serve not merely as a record of crimes exposed and justice served, but as a testament to the transformation of an entire community and the establishment of new methods in frontier law enforcement. Chief Deputy McAllister entered with the latest communications from Denver, where the federal prosecution team had begun processing the extensive evidence. The Justice Department has assigned their most senior prosecutors to these cases, he reported, positioning himself for optimal communication. They've already begun presenting evidence to the grand jury, and the initial indictments exceed all expectations in terms of scope and severity of charges. The transformation of Rattlesnake Junction manifested in numerous ways, both subtle and profound. The streets, once characterized by hurried movements and downcast eyes, now buzzed with the energy of liberated citizens. Businesses operated with newfound confidence, free from the extortion that had previously constrained their activities. The Territorial Governor's Office has initiated a comprehensive review of all administrative appointments, McAllister continued, reviewing the latest telegrams. Your evidence has prompted a systematic examination of how authority is delegated and monitored throughout the territory. They're implementing new oversight measures based directly on the vulnerabilities your investigation exposed. Martha, Hawkins, whose role had evolved from saloon keeper to crucial witness coordinator, provided insight into the community's psychological transformation. "The change goes deeper than just the absence of criminal control," she observed. "People are rediscovering their capacity for civic engagement. The town council meeting yesterday had more voluntary participation than we've seen in years. Citizens are actively involving themselves in rebuilding legitimate governance." Deputy Cooper, whose growth through the investigation had marked him as a promising future leader in law enforcement, reported on the continuing documentation efforts. "We've established a systematic process for recording witness statements and correlating them with your existing evidence," he explained. "Each new testimony reinforces the comprehensive nature of your investigation while revealing additional connections we hadn't previously identified." The federal investigation had expanded beyond initial expectations, revealing patterns of corruption that extended throughout the Western Territories. Thomas's methodical documentation provided a framework for understanding how criminal enterprises could infiltrate and subvert legitimate institutions, offering valuable insights for future law enforcement efforts. "Your methods represent a significant advancement in investigative techniques," Federal Marshal Harrison noted during his final consultation. "The way you utilized your perceived disability as an investigative advantage demonstrates the importance of challenging conventional assumptions about law enforcement capabilities. This case will likely become a model for future undercover operations." Thomas's approach to gathering evidence had proven remarkably effective. His inability to rely on verbal communication had led him to develop enhanced observational skills, allowing him to document subtle details that might have escaped notice through traditional investigative methods. The comprehensive nature of his evidence provided prosecutors with an unusually strong foundation for their cases. "The Territorial Prosecutor's Office has already begun implementing new procedural guidelines based on your methods," McAllister reported. "They're establishing specialized units focused on long-term investigations, incorporating the observational techniques you developed. Your success has prompted a fundamental reassessment of how we approach complex criminal investigations." The transformation of Rattlesnake Junction continued as the community reclaimed its civic identity. The town council, freed from criminal influence, began implementing reforms to prevent future corruption. Citizens participated actively in discussions about the community's future, demonstrating a renewed commitment to democratic governance. Martha's establishment, once a center of criminal activity, had become a symbol of the community's renewal. "The conversations have changed completely," she noted. "Instead of whispered warnings and fearful glances, people discuss plans for the future. Your patience showed them that positive change is possible, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable corruption." As evening settled over the town, Thomas reviewed the broader implications of his investigation. The evidence he had gathered would not only secure convictions, but would also serve as a foundation for systemic reform. His success demonstrated that effective law enforcement required more than just physical capability. It demanded patience, observation, and the ability to recognize opportunities in apparent limitations. The legacy of the investigation would extend far beyond the immediate cases. Thomas's methods had revealed new possibilities in law enforcement, challenging traditional assumptions about investigative techniques. The transformation of Rattlesnake Junction from a town controlled by fear to a community actively engaged in self-governance would serve as an example for other settlements struggling against corruption. The day's fading light cast long shadows through the marshal's office windows as Thomas completed his final report. The document represented not just the culmination of 3 years' work, but the beginning of a new era in frontier justice. His patient strategy had exposed corruption that seemed untouchable, demonstrating that true strength often lay in unexpected qualities, in careful observation, quiet persistence, and the courage to challenge established assumptions about capability. And justice. The final morning of Thomas Matthews' official assignment in Rattlesnake Junction arrived with a pristine clarity that seemed to mirror the town's transformation. As the sun rose over the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across the reformed settlement, Thomas stood on the marshal's office porch one last time, observing the profound changes his patient investigation had wrought. Chief Deputy McAllister approached with the final set of reports from Denver, where the prosecution of the corrupt network continued to expand in scope. The federal court has handed down its first round of indictments, he reported, ensuring clear visibility for Thomas's benefit. 47 officials across 3 territories now face charges. The evidence you gathered has proven instrumental in securing cooperation from several key witnesses, including former members of the territorial government. The transformation of Rattlesnake Junction had exceeded all expectations. Where once citizens hurried about their business with downcast eyes and hushed voices, now the streets bustled with open commerce and free discourse. The change manifested in countless small ways: shopkeepers chatting openly with customers, children playing freely in the streets, miners discussing their claims without fear of retribution. The Territorial Governor's Office has implemented comprehensive reforms based on your findings, McAllister continued, reviewing the latest communications. They're establishing new oversight procedures for all government appointments, incorporating safeguards against the type of systematic corruption you exposed. Your investigation has prompted a fundamental reassessment of how authority is delegated and monitored throughout the Western Territories. Martha Hawkins approached, carrying a final cup of coffee with honey, a simple gesture that embodied the trust and cooperation that had made the investigation possible. The town council met yesterday to establish permanent reforms, she reported. They're implementing new procedures for financial oversight and public accountability. Your work here has shown us not just how to fight corruption, but how to prevent its return. Deputy Cooper, whose growth through the investigation marked him as a future leader in frontier law enforcement, provided his final report on the town's transformation. The changes go beyond just the absence of criminal control, he observed. Citizens are actively participating in governance now. They understand that maintaining justice requires ongoing vigilance and community involvement. The federal investigation had revealed patterns of corruption that would inform law enforcement practices throughout the Western Territories. Thomas's methodical documentation provided a framework for understanding how criminal enterprises could infiltrate and subvert legitimate institutions, offering valuable insights for future investigations. Your methods will become standard practice for long-term undercover operations, Federal Marshal Harrison noted during his farewell briefing. The way you turned your perceived disability into an investigative advantage demonstrates the importance of questioning traditional assumptions about law enforcement capabilities. This case will serve as a model for future operations. Thomas's approach to gathering evidence had revolutionized investigative techniques. His reliance on visual observation and careful documentation had proven more effective than conventional methods, particularly in situations where criminal enterprises had compromised normal channels of investigation. The comprehensive nature of his evidence provided prosecutors with an unprecedented foundation for their cases. The Justice Department has established a special unit to study your methodologies, McAllister reported. They're particularly interested in your techniques for gathering and documenting evidence over extended periods. Your success has prompted a reassessment of how we approach complex criminal investigations. The transformation of Rattlesnake Junction continued as the community embraced its new identity. The town council, freed from criminal influence, implemented reforms to ensure transparent governance. Citizens participated actively in civic affairs, demonstrating a renewed commitment to democratic principles. Martha's establishment, once a center of criminal activity, had become a symbol of the community's renewal. "The conversations I overhear now give me hope," she reflected. "People discuss plans for the future instead of living in fear of the present. Your patience showed us that positive change is possible, even in the darkest circumstances." As morning progressed, Thomas completed his final preparations for departure. His next assignment would take him to another territory, where his unique investigative methods would be applied to new challenges. The legacy of his work in Rattlesnake Junction would continue to influence law enforcement throughout the Western territories. The success of the investigation demonstrated that effective law enforcement required more than just physical capability. It demanded patience, observation, and the ability to recognize opportunities in apparent limitations. Thomas's methods had revealed new possibilities in the fight against corruption, challenging traditional assumptions about investigative techniques. The transformation of Rattlesnake Junction from a town controlled by fear to a community actively engaged in self-governance would serve as an example for other settlements struggling against corruption. The patient strategy that had exposed seemingly untouchable criminal enterprises demonstrated that true strength often lay in unexpected qualities, in careful observation, quiet persistence, and the courage to challenge established assumptions about capability and justice. As Thomas mounted his horse for departure, the town gathered to bid farewell to the man who had transformed their community through his patient pursuit of justice. His legacy would live on not just in the reformed institutions and prosecuted criminals, but in the renewed spirit of a community that had learned the true meaning of justice and the power of persistent dedication to truth. Rattlesnake Junction stood as a testament to the possibility of positive change, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable corruption. The story of the deaf marshal, who had turned his perceived disability into an extraordinary advantage, would be told for generations, inspiring others to look beyond surface appearances and recognize that true strength often comes in unexpected forms. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.